Sorry about that. Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I did a show on Saturday with Dr. David Kemball-Cook, former biblical Unitarian, now turned skeptic, not an atheist, but an unbeliever in Jesus and the Bible. And during that show, we got into a little bit on Bayes' Theorem and David Hume and the prior probability of miracles, at which point I brought up the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula, because I find atheists and unbelievers and skeptics kind of just mindlessly assert that the prior probability of a miracle, such as Jesus raising from the dead, is extremely low, and they can't really provide any good reasons for that purpose. And during that show, when I brought up the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula, this was something David Kemball-Cook didn't really know a lot about, and he was asking certain questions and that sort of thing. And I admit I got a little bit annoyed at the, when he kind of asked me for specifics, which I didn't have offhand ready to go. And that was my fault entirely and that sort of thing. So to make it up to David KC, because obviously the series that I'm doing with him, I actually am hoping to help him, to bring him back to faith in Jesus and hopefully improve his faith, because unfortunately he was a Unitarian, so he wasn't a true Christian before, but I want to make him a Trinitarian, the truth in terms of Christianity. So that's my goal with the series. I actually do want to bring him back to a saving faith in Christ. And yeah, if I mean that in terms of helping out someone that I consider a friend, then I can't lose my temper or something like that when something goes, or get annoyed and frustrated with a friend. So this is kind of my way of making it up to him and going over the details that he was asking me about in that show on the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula. So yeah, just an announcement before I get into that. Obviously, it's a great view. You can see that's in Greece, I think Neftali. So that's my background for today. But an RSM announcement is I'm going to be taking a break in February, at least for a couple weeks. This is my belated Christmas vacation, because I never got to take a break during December like I wanted to. So for the next couple weeks, I'm going to have no new podcasts. I may be on the Faith Unaltered thing this Friday, but I'll post that up on Real Seekers, in March sometime or later. But I do have one podcast scheduled in February on the Shroud of Turin, and it's a debate, my Shroud Wars, on the radiation hypotheses. So that's going to be on February 17th, around 11 a.m., I believe, sometime between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. And it's going to be Bob Rucker and Hugh Ferry debating all of the various radiation hypotheses to explain the Shroud images, both natural, because there's an ordinary naturalistic radiation hypothesis, and all of the supernatural or extraordinary radiation hypotheses. So don't miss out for that on February 17th. But just be aware, in the next couple of weeks, I'm not going to be posting up podcasts because I'm taking a vacation. So yeah, with that said, let's get straight into it. Let me share my screen. Slides. Bada boom, bada bing. Okay. Oh, my mouse is slow. Sorry, guys. Okay, so I think that's showing up. All right. So the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula for calculating the prior probability of a miracle. Now, in terms of my methodology, I just want to make something clear here that I didn't in the show because it wasn't relevant to David Hume. But it's important to note that when I did my own religious research and coming to faith, I employed an 11 premise argument. At that time, it was 11. It's now more, but as I fix it up. But premise one is where I evaluated in its own right, God exists. So I don't use the Bayes formula. All right, that's separated out as premise one. And obviously, whatever the degree of warrant is for each of my 11 premises, I multiply all of that in the end to get the final figure. And in terms of the prior probability of a miracle, or at least religion authenticating miracles, that's premise 7 in my argument, which is where I would get into issues kind of pertaining to the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula and that sort of thing. So I didn't use the straightforward formula. I didn't use Bayes' theorem when I was evaluating the historical evidence for the resurrection or the evidence for the shroud. And that's mostly because I didn't need it. I didn't need a cumulative probability because in those cases, at the time of my conversion, I just had one argument for each kind of thing. Now, where I did use Bayes' theorem is not with respect to, oh, well, what's the probability that the resurrection is true given the evidence and background evidence? But I used it with respect, well, what's the prior probability that Christianity is true? Or more specifically, that Christianity has religion authenticating miracles attesting to its God endorsement. That was my hypothesis for which I used Bayes and for which I needed a cumulative argument. From the shroud, from the appearance of the 12, and that sort of thing, and my vindication prediction argument, plus the properly basic belief induced by the Holy Spirit within me. So I had 4 evidences, and I would plug that into Bayes, and bada boom, bada bing, I got the total that, yep, Christianity is true and or endorsed by God via religion authenticating miracles and events. So that's what I used Bayes for in my own assessment. So, but that wasn't relevant to the show I did with David Kemball-Cook, because there we're just doing a simplistic, the resurrection hypothesis, and everything else is employed. So that's where the Jeffery Conditionalization Formula kind of condenses my premise 1, premise 7, and premise 8, and premise 11 all together, and kind of just in one formula, right? And you can see the more details on my 11 premise argument and my personal approach in these YouTube links. This will be on the blog for people that want to look into it. So basically just another thing is the form of Bayes' theorem that I used. Here's the proper Bayes' theorem with conditional probabilities. So you have the probability that of having the evidence that we have given we assume the resurrection hypothesis is true, times the prior probability factor, which is the resurrection given the background evidence. Things like, well, does God exist or not? That would be background evidence, right? And then you compare that to the bottom denominator to get your total, right? Obviously, you compare it to, well, what's the probability we would have the same evidence given the resurrection didn't happen, that it was false? And what's the intrinsic probability, prior probability that the resurrection hypothesis would be false? You can skeptics bring up a whole host of stuff that I find unpersuasive, but, they can bring up a whole bunch of stuff. Miracles are implausible, stuff like that. Now, there is a difference in my approach when I use Bayes' theorem. Here's the difference here. I used my own formula. I didn't use conditional probabilities. Again, none of this has any relevance to the show that I did with Dr. David Kemball-Cook, but I'm just bringing it up just so you can see that where my approach differs with the actual formula. But obviously against David Hume, I was using the actual formula itself. But all of our debate is just about this fact. David Hume only argues about this factor, the prior probability of the resurrection hypothesis being true, given the relevant background knowledge and evidence. And he says that's extremely low. Now, if you want more details on the differences in Bayes' theorem versus my own Bayes-ish approach, I go into that in great detail in my show Calculus for Christ with David Johnson. The YouTube link is here in the slides, so go and check those out. I'm going to bypass that because it's not relevant to my show with David Kemball-Cook. Okay, so here's what's relevant. So here's the formula that we should use and that David Hume sucked and didn't do. His argument only pertains to this against using testimonial evidence. He just says, well, given the uniformity of our experience of nature, right, nature's regularities, it's extremely low that the resurrection hypothesis would be true. What's the background evidence? Well, it's the uniformity of nature. That's it. That's all he's got, and that sort of thing. He doesn't really address, well, what if there's the evidence is for the resurrection, right? Given the resurrection is true, it provides a lot of explanatory power for explaining the evidence that we have, and that may be extremely high, even overruling, even if this prior probability factor was low. And then obviously we compare it to the negations and we get our total formula. Is it more probable than not? You believe. Is it improbable? You disbelieve. Or is it 50-50? Now, where we got into a little spat here is I brought up the Jeffery Conditionalization Formula. That's a way to break up and calculate this yellow thing specifically, the prior probability of the resurrection hypothesis on the background knowledge. So the Jeffery Conditionalization Formula is only concerned with calculating this. And what I said in my religious research, I argue for this in premise 7 of my argument, but I argue that this is the 50%. The default is 50%, and we have no reasons to go higher or lower a priori. So it remained at 50% when I calculated evaluated the various religion authenticating miracles and the direct evidence in terms of this factor here, or rather in my own approach, it was this factor here. Okay, cool. So looking at that, let's remind us what the Jeffery Conditionalization Formula is. So it's P, probability of the resurrection is true given the background evidence. And in order to get that, well, we first have to know what's the probability that the resurrection hypothesis would be true given we assume GM. And I've clarified this from G to GM just to make it clear. So GM is assuming God exists and he has a sufficient religious motivation for raising Jesus from the dead, for doing the miracle. And how do we know there's a sufficient religious motivation? Well, we can detect that there is a religion authenticating context. This is a miracle report. Jesus' resurrection is a miracle reported in divinely inspired literature, claimed, not assuming it's inspired, but it's claimed to be. And it's claimed that this is an essential belief of the Christian faith. That's a religion authenticating context. Now, we're not assuming that God has this motivation or not. We're going to calculate that on the background evidence. And that's what this second factor is all about. But in terms of this first factor here, is what's the probability that the resurrection is true given God exists and he had a sufficient religious motivation for raising Jesus from the dead? In that case, it's 100%. David Kemball-Cook wanted numbers. It's 100%. It's just obvious. God's omnipotent. He's omniscient. He's a real maximally great being. He has all the power to do it. Nothing in the universe can stop him from doing it if he wants to do it. And GM assumes he wants to do it. So therefore, it's 100%. The resurrection 100% would happen. It would be impossible for it not to happen if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus from the dead. So that's an obvious 100%. Obviously, some of the debate's going to come here, and this is what David Kemball-Cook was rightly in the show, and I missed that a little bit in my frustrations, but he was rightly saying, well, what is this the 50% thing? And I would say yes, but the probability that GM is true. So it's what's the prior probability that God exists as a real maximally great being, and it's a conjunction here, and he does in fact have a sufficient religious motivation for existing given our background evidence. Okay, so on this front, we would have to assess two factors here, as we'll see. Number one, given the background evidence, is it more probable than not that God does exist? What is that number? Times, and even if God does exist, what's the probability, given our background evidence, that he has a sufficient religious motivation for raising Jesus from the dead? Okay, and then you have to add that to, well, forget it. Let's pretend GM is false. God doesn't exist, and or he exists, but he doesn't have a sufficient religious motivation for raising Jesus from the dead. Well, if that's the case, what is the likelihood that the resurrection of Jesus would have happened? Jesus would have risen from the dead. Times PR. So again, that God doesn't exist and or doesn't have the sufficient religious motivation for existing, given our background knowledge. And okay, so yep, okay, so cool. So here's what I said in the show, right? So my assumed default was the probability of the resurrection given B in Bayes' formula proper was 50%. This is what I plugged into all my calculations when I was assessing religion authenticating miracles for Islam, for Christianity, whatever it was. Because if there was a detectable or provable religion authenticating context, that was the way. That's there whether it's true or not, kind of thing, right? Whether God exists or not, kind of thing. There is this religion authenticating context, and that's what gives me insight into this. I'm using to give me insight. Well, is there a sufficient religious motivation or not? Well, a sufficient religious motivation would be if God exists and he inspired Christianity, well, he would want to miraculously authenticate that. So Yeah, that's where we're kind of getting that. Obviously, we have that further question. Well, is it true or not, given the background evidence itself? But I'm just trying to explain with the 50%. That's where in light of the fact that in premise 1 I established God exists, and in premise 7 I established that in certain contexts where there's a religion authenticating context present or detected, there is an equal prior probability, before we look at the specific or direct evidence for the resurrection itself, that God would want to raise Jesus from the dead or perform this religion authenticating miracle or not. It all comes down to the fact of, well, what was God's motivation? And on the background evidence, I looked at certain arguments for and against it that I'll look at, but I didn't find them persuasive. But let's break that down in terms of the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula. Where am I correct about this 50%? If I actually substitute my real numbers in here, which I didn't do during my religious research just because I wasn't evaluating it like this. I broke it up into a deductive argument with premises, and I separated elements like premise 1 being God, proving God exists or not, and then premise 7 is on the motivation aspect. Premise 8 and premise 11 technically is on the specific evidence and stuff. So, but if we put it into this conditionalization formula, okay, in terms of the prior probability, I said 50%, right? So let's see if we plug in the numbers into this equation and I get 50%. I said if I put in real numbers, it would be higher than 50%. So I cheated. In my religious, by doing my assumed default 50%, I cheated for the atheists and skeptics and unbelievers against any kind of religious miracle kind of thing. So let's see if that's true or not, right? So in terms of the probability that the resurrection would be true, given God exists and he has the religious motivation to raise Jesus from the dead, that's 100%. That's 100%, right? So here's 100% plugged into the formula for this factor here. Then you have to multiply it. But what is the prior probability that God exists and in fact has this religious motivation for raising Jesus from the dead, given the actual evidence, the background evidence that we have? So on the first front, in terms of there's two aspects here. We have to prove God exists on the background evidence, and we have to prove he has a sufficient motivation to raise Jesus from the dead on the background evidence. Now, in terms of the first aspect, I told David K.C. during the show that it was 99.99% because of the ontological argument alone. Now, that was actually wrong on my part. It's actually 100% now because I utilize Eugen Nagasawa's argumentation, and with my work, master's thesis refuting the evil God challenge. The only reason it wasn't at 100 here in terms of the ontological argument and saying that it's possible that logically possible that God exists, defined as a real maximally great being, is because there was a canceling parity from a real maximally evil being. And that caused me to have some doubt. I didn't have absolute knowledge. Now that I've done the studies into the Evil God Challenge and did my master's thesis on it, I'm an amateur expert on the Evil God Challenge. That parity has been totally destroyed and refuted through my work. So I'm at 100% for this premise. So I would really be at 100%. But because I said 99.99%, reflecting my previous stance on the ontological argument, I'm going to stick with that just for illustration purposes. So let's go with the worst case scenario, right? So this is what the number I told David KC. So let's stick with 99.99 just for the sake of argument. Great. So then we have, okay, what about the green side? What's the probability that the resurrection hypothesis would be true? Jesus rose from the dead, given God doesn't exist, or, so not and, but or. In mathematics, that's a difference. Or God exists, but he doesn't have a sufficient religious motivation for raising Jesus from the dead. And, in the show, David Kemball-Cook said, oh, well, it's 0% and stuff like that. I think it's virtually zero. I said that myself, but I don't know. I think I'm warranted in saying it's not 0%. It's extremely low, but I'm assigning 1%. Maybe there's, I find maybe aliens raised Jesus from the dead. I find that extremely improbable. It's an unreasonable thing. It's got less than a 5% probability of truth, in my opinion. Or maybe there's some kind of interdimensional beings, or time travel might be possible, or something like this, and they raised Jesus from the dead. So I'm going to go with a 1%. Let's say there's a 1%. This is my warranted subjective probability value for this factor right here. Okay, so, and I think I could provide that a reasonable, rational person who's a reasonable real seeker could provide a 1% as value. Now, it could be lower too. I've got this range, and I believe it or not, I also think that even saying 0 is a warranted subjective probability. So if you wanted to put 0 in there, that's fine, right? David Kemball is right. And in fact, that's what I did myself for this side of the equation when I did my own religious research. But because David Kemball is challenging me to be as truthful and real as I can at this moment, I wouldn't put it at 0. I would say I'm at most maybe like a 1%. So let's say that times this factor. Well, what's the prior probability that either God doesn't exist, or, again, not and, but or God doesn't have a sufficient religious motivation for raising Jesus from the dead on the background evidence and knowledge? Well, splitting it up, the fact that God doesn't exist, well, our background knowledge, we already saw it's 99.99% as a worst case scenario. So that automatically here, it's 0.01%, right? 100% minus 99.99 equals 0.01%. So that's on the background knowledge. That's what we plug here. Plus, because it's an or, we have to add here. It's not a multiplication, because remember, this thing here is a conjunction, right? There's two elements, that God exists and he has a religious motivation. When it's an and, that means you multiply. And so that means it's going to be lower, because in order to have success, in order for this to be true, both elements have to be true. In order for a GM to be false, this is what we learn in teaching basic logic to students. There are 3 ways it can be false. Either God doesn't exist. Number 2, God doesn't exist, but he doesn't have a sufficient religious motivation. M is false for raising Jesus from the dead. Or both are false. God doesn't exist and he doesn't have a religious motivation. Obviously, that it's well, how can he have a motivation if God doesn't exist? Beings that don't exist don't have motivations. That's kind of a technicality. But the point that I'm getting here is that we're not going to multiply here. We're actually adding on this side, because it's an or, right? We're assessing it. Well, it's false if God doesn't exist, or it's also false if God doesn't have the motivation. So there are multiple ways for this to be wrong. And that's why we're adding and not multiplying like we did on this side. We're adding, right? So 0.01% for God exists as a worst case scenario, plus 50%, right? Because, 50% that he does have this religious motivation on the background evidence. That's what I think the evidence warrants. I think it's inscrutable, as Dr. Mike Lacona says. We have no way of adjudicating a priori what God's motivations or divine psychology is with respect to raising Jesus from the dead. And so that's why we would assign 50% here. 100% minus 50% equals 50% here for the M on this side too. So they're both equal. Okay, great. Now, just so you know, well, what if you want to ask, well, maybe it's not 50%. Maybe it's not inscrutable, as Mike Lacona says, or maybe we're not at this neutral thing. And certain philosophers have tried to come up with arguments, a priori arguments, to say that no, this factor is higher than 50% or lower than 50%. So here's a couple of examples. Richard Swinburne, he makes in his argument for the resurrection in his book, and I've linked to that on my blogs on shows for the resurrection, so you can read that for free. He argues it's not the probability that God has the motivation to raise Jesus from the dead is way higher than 50%, because we can prove through arguments and evidence on the background evidence that the Christian God is true. And he gives this argument for the Trinity based on actualizing love. And he said, in order to actualize love, you need a second person to love and then to love you. But you have to actualize selfless love. So therefore, you need a third person for that third person to love the second person to love the third person, and you're not needed there. So it's not a selfish actualized love. It's a selfless actualized love. And that's his argument of saying, well, you need three. Which religion teaches that God is three persons? Only Christianity. So therefore, on the background evidence, it is extreme. It's 100%. Richard Swinburne literally calculates 97%, or I think he says 97%. So instead of 50, he would plug in 97% here, and then 3% on this end. And obviously that raises the prior probability immensely, right? No, in my own research, I didn't buy that argument totally. And so therefore I didn't use it as a way of saying, haha, got you atheists and skeptics. The prior probability is extremely high that God would raise Jesus from the dead because he exists and he's motivated to do so. But on the other side, some atheists have tried to speak to divine psychology too on this front, and they've tried to say, look, it's not 50%, but it's lower, much lower than 50%. And as we'll look at in a bit, David Casey tried to give one, I think, on that front. It's not successful, but a much better one is from Vol the Atheist, and David Casey knows Vol. He's from the Skeptics and Seekers boards, and he tries to make a divine psychology thing, right? So he doesn't make the typical atheists and skeptics will make this really stupid argument from prior probability, and they'll say, well, look at all the people that have existed and they haven't risen from the dead. God never raises people from the dead. 99.99999% of people who die stay dead. God never raises them from the dead. And we go, true, but so what? That's stupid. That doesn't mean there's a 1 out of 20 billion chance that God would raise Jesus from the dead, because we're not asking what's the prior probability that God would randomly raise Jesus, that's just a random person, from the dead. That's not what we're asking. Or we're not saying the natural thing. Like, what's the prior probability that Jesus would just randomly raise from the dead without God or anything like that? Nobody's asking that. So that's totally irrelevant. And Val realizes that. So he's a little more nuanced. He speaks to God and he says, okay, great, let's assume God exists. But I'm just challenging the M here and saying that's less than 50% because, and how do we tell? Well, he points to either all the religious figures, or a smarter one would be, well, look at all the people in the Bible, all the religious figures in the Bible who don't rise. And on that front, yeah, Moses didn't rise from the dead. Isaiah didn't rise from the dead. Mary didn't rise from the dead. So the vast majority of religious figures, even limiting it to the Bible, is really low, right? I think David Johnson has argued that up to 10 people in the Bible have been said to have risen from the dead. So let's even assume that that's just true by definition. That's like 10 out of how many thousands of biblical characters are there and names mentioned in the Bible? I don't know. Let's say 10,000. So there's 10 divided by 10,000 prior probability, very low. And that was Val's the atheist divine psychology argument for the prior probability of God raising Jesus from the dead. But of course, again, that misses the point because that doesn't speak to God's motive. No one said God didn't have a sufficient religious motivation to raise Moses from the dead. And that's the flaw with Val the atheist divine psychology argument, because really what you want, if you want Val's argument to work, you have to say, okay, well, we know, just taking the Bible as is, there are 10 cases, again, assuming David Johnson is correct, that there are 10 resurrection accounts in the Bible. I don't know if it's that many, but it's 10 or less. Let's assume it's 10 for the sake of argument. Great. So of the 10, how many of those 10 can you prove didn't happen historically? So for example, Lazarus, if the atheist or the skeptic can prove that Lazarus didn't raise from the dead on a balance of probabilities, and let's say you can do that for 6 out of the 10. Okay, great. Then I'll grant you this should be less than 50%. It would be 40%. 4 divided by 10, 40%, not 50%. Only if the atheist or skeptic can prove that 6 out of the 10 or more religious figures where the Bible says God had a motivation for those people to rise and they didn't raise from the dead, that would be relevant. That would give you a lower prior probability. Fortunately, the atheists and skeptics can't do anything like that. They don't even attempt that at all. So they've got nothing. And that's why Val the atheist argument fails. It's just, He appeals to the wrong reference class, and when you look at the right reference class, there's no evidence proving that the prior probability is low. As for all we know, there's an equal probability that God rose 10 out of 10 of the people that it says God had a religious motivation for raising those people. We don't know either way on the evidence. I can't prove one way or the other whether Lazarus rose from the dead or whether Tabitha rose from the dead or something like that for the sake of argument. So if that's the case, it's neutral. It remains at the 50% level. Okay, so that's my little spiel on that bit. Okay, then I calculated out. Again, this is a worst case scenario. And look what you do when I get my real numbers. Bada boom, bada bing. I was correct. 50.49% as a worst case here. Helping the atheists and skeptics. As a worst case, it's above 50% as the prior probability that I would plug in to this Bayes theorem right here. I didn't do that in my religious research. I cheated for the atheists and assumed that the default at 50%, right? But yeah, if you want it, here I plugged in the real numbers for you, David KC, and I got over 50%, just as I predicted. So yeah, these are my numbers. That's how I would do it. My slides will be on my blog, so you can take a look at that. Let's get into a bit more detail. So why is 50% the default? David KC took issue with this. Well, it's because logically, the philosophical principle of indifference asserts that if there is no known reason for predicating of our subject one way rather than another of several alternatives, then relative to such knowledge, the assertions of each of these alternatives have an equal probability. So there is an equal prior probability and or probability in general. If you have no evidence, and or in this case, background evidence specifically, favoring one hypothesis over an alternative hypothesis or a set of alternative hypotheses, you assign an equal probability to all of them, right? To all of them being true, randomly speaking, kind of thing, right? And in the case of Bayes' theorem, the way that formula works is we're assessing the truth of a specific hypothesis, right? So in this case, it's that the resurrection, Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, it's not even that God rose Jesus from the dead, because the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula wouldn't include the green aspect, right? So obviously, in terms of this version with R, it's not that God rose Jesus from the dead. I misspoke before. If it was that God rose Jesus from the dead, then we would have to get rid of this green part of the equation. But I'm just saying, in terms of David Hume and responding to him, the hypothesis is that Jesus rose from the dead, either by God doing it because he had a motivation, or naturally he just rose from the dead because aliens did it, or interdimensional beings, or maybe it's just a natural anomaly, some kind of weird, he got some kind of gecko DNA mutation in him, and okay, he can die and then come back 3 days later. And certainly we have tons of cases of people dying for prolonged periods of time and raising from the dead and coming back. And most atheists and skeptics admit this medical fact of history, with thousands of people dying and rising from the dead, but they come back and they just explain, oh, it's a natural anomaly or something happened, but they try to explain it away or something like that. So it is possible naturally, and that sort of thing from the atheist perspective. Obviously, as Christians, we would say, no, that's God raising these people too. Yeah, okay, so that explains that. So that's why, right? So we're assessing the truth of the hypothesis. God rose Jesus from the dead, the probability of R, given the evidence and the background knowledge. So if you come out with evidence for and against, and you come out with any values 51% to 100%, right? Anything greater than 50% means, yup, the hypothesis R is probably true. It's probably true Jesus rose from the dead. Now, if you have anything lower than 50%, 49% down to 0% is, nope, it's probably false that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's the falsity of the hypothesis. So that's a different hypothesis in a way. Bayes understands that as another hypothesis, saying it is true that Jesus did not rise from the dead. So that's the way Bayes' theorem understands it. And 50% is right in the middle. It doesn't affect the calculations. It doesn't raise the probability, or it doesn't lower the probability, or make the it doesn't make the hypothesis probably true. It doesn't make the hypothesis improbable to be true, aka probable to be false. So that's why 50% it represents the principle of indifference. And in the absence of any evidence, either background evidence or posteriori evidence, if we don't have any of that, the default is 50% in Bayes' theorem, because that's assigning an equal probability. Either the hypothesis is true, and it's equally probable that the hypothesis is false, unless and until we get some evidence, either background evidence and or direct evidence for the hypothesis to favor either it's true or either it's not. There's only the two hypotheses at stake. And any and all specific things like a lying hypothesis or empty or whatever it is, delusion, or these are contained within the hypothesis is false. The resurrection is false hypothesis. That's included in the 49 to 0%. Right? So if you have evidence, let's say that as an a priori, you can either have direct evidence. Let's say David KC has proof that the disciples lied, and he thinks it's 60% proven that the disciples lied given this evidence. Let's just say he's right. Great. So that would lower. I would plug in 40% into Bayes' theorem then, because 100% minus 60%, converting it into the positive hypothesis, right? So if there's a 60% that Jesus did not rise from the dead, that's the same as saying 100 minus 60, there's a 40% chance that Jesus did rise from the dead, given this one piece of evidence that David has proving the disciples lied, supposedly. So that's one way you can lower. There's also an a priori thing, right? And this is what David Hume tries to do in his stage 2 argument. He tries to say, well, all we have is testimonial evidence, and testimonial evidence in general to miracles specifically is unreliable. Why? Well, because people are motivated to lie about these things. Secondly, because they, he gives his 4 reasons. And one of them is, I'm a racist pig. White people are civilized. Blacks and browns, they're primitive little barbarian hordes. They don't know any better. And that's why miracle claims abound in these primitive cultures over there. He was a product of his time. He lived in the 1700s. He was a racist pig. So, yeah, that was, he gave these kinds of reasons to say a priori, because the evidence for Jesus rising from the dead is testimonial evidence in the documents, and we have these general reasons to discount testimonial evidence for resurrections and miracles like that. Therefore, it's a priori improbable. And again, if we assign a 70%, let's say that you're convinced by David Hume's general thing against that, and you're 70% certain the resurrection is false. Okay, 100% minus 70% equals there's a 30% probability that the resurrection is true. And that's the number you would plug into Bayes' theorem. Again, because the hypothesis is stated in positive terms, that it's true, Jesus rose from the dead. So that's how you handle that. Only the 50% mark is neutral between the truth or falsity of the hypothesis. It makes no impact one way or the other on the overall calculation. And that's why I say it's the default, unless and until you present reasons, either direct evidence or background evidence, to favor the truth or falsity of the hypothesis, and plug that into Bayes' theorem. And here's proof. So I've given proof here, kind of thing. So in terms of the hypothesis God exists, I give a list of various evidences. Again, those numbers don't matter. That's just for the sake of illustration. But what matters for our purposes here is this red thing about the prior probability, right? And if I plug in 50%, it doesn't make any impact, right? If I took out this 50%, we would still arrive at 53.85. The multiplying by 50% here in the negative terms does not affect the calculation. We could take that out entirely, and the final calculation of all these numbers in the yellow would still be 53.85. It's only when the prior probability is higher or lower than 50% that it impacts the overall calculation. And here is the proof right here. So here's the same numbers with the hypothesis God exists, given the evidence and background knowledge. With the 50%, remember, we came out to 53.85. When you put in a lower than 50%, so let's put in 30% for the prior probability. That means 100 in negative terms, that you would plug in 70% here, right? Because this is the prior probability that the hypothesis is false, that it's false that God exists, given the evidence, or given the background evidence. You plug that in, oh, what do you know? It's less, it went down from 53.85 down to 33.33. Bada boom, bada bing, just like what I said. Only the 50-50 doesn't make an impact. What if we plugged in a higher probability? Let's say 60% is the prior probability that God exists, just for the sake of argument. Again, well, that means the prior probability that God does not exist would be 100 minus 60 equals 40%. And oh, bada bing, bada boom, what do you know? We get 63.63. It went up. The total went up from 53.85. And again, this is assuming all of the a posteriori numbers, or the numbers based on the explanatory power and direct evidence, stayed the same. It's 0.007 in all three of these cases. So it's not a matter of we're having different direct evidence or something like that. It's all about the background evidence impacting on the prior probability and whether that raises or lowers relative to 50%. Right? So if I had, again, just to repeat, if I had the exact same numbers and I just took out the 50, so I had 0.007 divided by 0.007 plus 0.006, and I plugged that in, I would get 53.85. Adding in the prior probability factor at the 50% level, it doesn't impact the calculation at all. I still get 53.85. It's only when I put in a lower number that it goes down, or if I put in a higher number greater than 50, then it goes up. So that's the mathematical proof in front of your eyes that 50% represents, in Bayes terminology, the principle of indifference. That is the number that you put in by default before you start looking at the background evidence and or direct evidence. And or if there is no persuasive evidence on the balance of probabilities either way, to think the hypothesis, it's true, God exists, probably, and or on the opposite end, it's false, God exists, probably, then you remain at the 50-50 percentile mark. And that was my point. My premise 7 was arguing that of all the reasons I've seen presented to try to say the prior probability for a miracle like Jesus rising from the dead, or the shroud, forming the shroud images at the resurrection, whatever, should be higher or lower, none of them were persuasive to my mind. So that's why I remained at the default 50-50, because that's the same as having no evidence. The evidences are unpersuasive or unwarranted, saying, yep, probably God exists, or probably Jesus rose from the dead, and or on the other side, yeah, probably it's false Jesus rose from the dead, or probably it's false that God exists. If that's just not persuasive on a balance of probabilities, that means they fail, and I'm stuck at the neutral position. And that's why I put in 50-50. But as we saw, I'm not going, thanks to David Kemball-Cook, I'm not going to give the atheists and skeptics the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to put in a higher probability, prior probability now, because I was forced to plug in those numbers. And what do you know? Bada boom, bada bing, 50.49. So thank you, David Kemball-Cook, for making the case for Christianity even stronger. Amazing. Okay, so, yeah, perfect. Okay, so just a couple of objections that David Kemball-Cook raised here, right? So one thing is that David Kemball-Cook is, hang on one second, I'm going to come back to this, just going to take a break. Okay, so David Kemball-Cook still has a couple more of objections in the show that we did last Saturday. And I think it's called David Hume and Miracles with David Kemball-Cook or something like that. Look in the blog, I'll include the link to that show, but anyways, or in the YouTube video description. But David Kemball-Cook says, look, you're just using subjective probability values to plug into Bayes and into the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula. That should be JCF. So he says, well, atheists and skeptics can substitute in their own subjective probability value. Surely you're not going to argue that you're the only one that's warranted, that, you put in your own numbers there. Well, what if somebody puts a different subjective percent value in there in terms of the level of credence they have for one of these factors? And he gives the example, well, let's say it would be 0%, right? The prior probability would be 0% because maybe an atheist like David Johnson will come along and say, well, the probability that God exists is 0% on the background evidence. Or that the prior probability that God would have a motivation to raise Jesus from the dead, given the background evidence, is 0%. Or or maybe they wouldn't put 100% here, they put 99%, and so on and so forth, or they would have different numbers here, right? So what do you do with that? That you can get any number then. If we're just using subjective probabilities here, the sky's the limit as to what we can assign. Now, here, unfortunately for the skeptic, David Casey, he doesn't understand how I do subjective probabilities, because there are warranted subjective probabilities and there are unwarranted subjective probabilities. It's a semi-objective standard, right? So it's yes, in terms of the level of credence, that is subjective, but it's not just based on illogical feelings. Oh, I just feel that it's 199.99% proven that God exists. No, I'm warranted in assigning that level of credence. And this is where I get into my talk, and I covered this in my show, The Calculus for Christ, with David Johnson. In one of the shows, I think it came up more in one of our follow-up shows to the Calculus for Christ episode. So check all of those out, where David finally got it, that there is this reasonableness range, reasonableness in the legal law court semi-objective standard that every court uses every day to say a reasonable person would or wouldn't do this, right? So you can plead ignorance of the law. You can plead, oh, well, in my case, I didn't know this, but the courts will say you're guilty. It doesn't matter, because a reasonable person ought to have known this. And in this case, I'm saying it's the same thing. There's a reasonableness range. So I can allow for different subjective probability values. You don't have to be 99.99%. Maybe you're 97%. Maybe you're 99.98%. For something that I said I'm 99.99 for. Great. Depending on the nature or strength or weakness of the evidence itself, there is what's called a reasonableness range, or a warranted-ish range, whereby I think people can be warranted, or at the very least warranted-ish, I'll explain that in a moment, in the subjective probability values they assign. But there's also people that are unreasonable, where the courts... So, for example, with the Holocaust, very strong evidence that we have. Maybe I would say I'm 99.9% that the Holocaust happened. Maybe David Casey, you would say you're 100%, or maybe you'd say you're 98%, or something like that. The point is, the strength of the evidence, the nature of the evidence, says we're both reasonable and warranted, or warranted-ish, in assigning those values, even though they're different. However, some guy from the Middle East comes around and says, no, the evidence, I've seen the exact same evidence you have, but I'm only 13% convinced that the Holocaust happened. That guy's unreasonable. He's outside of the reasonableness range. He's not a reasonable person, or as I say in a religious context, you have to be a reasonable, real seeker. So you have to fulfill the three criteria for being a real seeker. That's how the Holy Spirit can operate on and fix our cognitive faculties to evaluate these things properly. And you also have to be reasonable, just the reasonable law court standard. If you're a reasonable real seeker, then the subjective probability value that you assign would be warranted-ish. Again, assuming all else being equal. Maybe God might have special reasons for deluding you temporarily, as long as he doesn't do that up until the point of no return. That's fine. That's a different issue, a theological thing. But I'm just saying, all else being equal, if you fulfill this, then yep, you will be warranted-ish in the percent value that you assign. And if you're not a reasonable real seeker, well, then you can assign any number of subjective probabilities, but they're all going to be wrong, irrelevant, Satan-inspired nonsense, or sinful, or sin-corrupted. Obviously, different people have different levels of corruption based on sin. The effects of sin affect our cognitive faculties differently. So, maybe someone's not as corrupted as another, even though they're not a reasonable real seeker, and they come up with a warranted-ish answer. But yeah, I mean, there are people that deny 1 + 1 = 2. These people are unreasonable. They're so infected by their cognitive faculties are so infected by sin that they're just ridiculous. Same with flat earthers. I think the evidence, it's unreasonable. There's a less than 5% probability that, given the evidence, but there are people out there that look at the evidence and they still conclude this, right? So there are some people out there, but yeah, that doesn't take away from the fact that there is a reasonableness range given the strength relative to the strength and weakness of the evidence in question. Now, this is in epistemology, this is called a permissivist epistemic situation, where I think God permits different people to be warranted or warranted-ish, is what I say. Even though they assign different values to the same evidence, again, because of sin, we're never going to be exactly the same. We're very rarely going to be exactly the same when all is said and done. All of our cognitive faculties have been affected to some slight degree, at least, and that sort of thing. So it's going to be very rare. Only in the cases of maybe like self-evident propositions would we assign the same thing to like 100% to something like 1 + 1 = 2 or whatever. But in most cases, it's not going to be that straightforward, and that's just because of sin. But we're still rational in assigning the values that we give or can be. Now, this is in contrast to the uniqueness thesis, which is the view of Richard Feldman and myself. I take a theistic uniqueness thesis. So that means that the level of credence, there is only 1% value, the epistemic level of credence that God would give based on the evidence and assuming he was not omniscient and stuff like that. Like, if God was in our place and he was only privy to the evidence that we had as a hypothetical, he would assign a 70% to this or an 85% or whatever it is. That's the only level that is truly warranted proper in the Alvin Plantinga definition of warrant. Everything else is wrong. So if God's 85 and I'm 84, I'm wrong. But God restrains, for all reasonable real seekers, the claim is he restrains the corruption sin can do on our cognitive faculties, and so that the 84% isn't sufficient to be what I called warranted-ish. And therefore, I can take confidence in that thing and be that I'm rational and stuff like that. This is a debate way outside of Bayes' theorem, but I just wanted to show that I've done the legwork, working with the experts in philosophy and I've covered this in follow-up shows to the Calculus for Christ thing with David Johnson and stuff like that. So I've done the work. I'm not just saying, well, subjective probabilities, just arbitrary, whatever you feel. Oh, you woke up and ate a cookie. I'm feeling good today, so the evidence for God is 20%. Oh, shoot, I've changed my mind today. Now it's 22%. That's not what I'm saying by subjective probability. I'm talking about warranted or warranted-ish subjective probability values that a reasonable real seeker would assign given this evidence. That's would or could assign. And that's what I'm talking about here. It's not just willy-nilly any subjective thing based on your feelings. I'm feeling pretty low today, so I'm going to give God a 2% thing just because I feel like it. No, that's not what we're talking about. It has to be warranted. It has to be something that a reasonable real seeker would and or at least could assign as a rational agent and someone who's really seeking God. So that's how we measure whether the subjective probability values. Now, I would argue the values that I gave in my own calculation, they fit this. And I can provide the warranted reason, and I have done so in certain cases, some cases providing hundreds of written pages attesting to my reasonable real seekerness and how I qualify as being warranted-ish in these values. David Hume never did that. Never did that, really. So yeah, that's it on that. Here's the last objection David K.C. gave. And this was also raised by David Johnson. He tried to argue that the prior probability for the resurrection hypothesis is very, very low. Why? Well, because there are thousands of religions in the world. So we can't just assume Christianity is true. That would be fallacious question begging, wouldn't it? In fact, on Skeptics and Seekers board, the infamous Darren Lute also raises this, foolishly thinking it's a good objection, but it's really foolish. But they say, look, the prior probability of a Christian-specific miracle, like Jesus is rising from the dead, that's like 1 divided by 1,000 or even lower. But just 1 divided by 1,000, that's really, really low. So it's extremely low what we would put in terms of God, even if he exists, having the motivation, whereas the Jeffery Conditionalization, the M here would be 1 divided by 1,000. Even if you grant that God exists, it's still going to be 100% times 1 divided by 1,000, which is really low, like 1/100th or 1% or something like that. And that's me being generous, right? It's obviously in reality going to be much lower than 1/1000. Now, how do I respond? The problem is, again, we have to be cognizant of what the precise nature of the hypothesis is that we're plugging into Bayes' theorem and using to consider when we're doing our Bayesian analysis. And David KC is very sloppy. I find this from unbelievers all the time. They're not, and it's surprising because he says he knows about math, but he's not being specific here. The hypothesis is not what is the a priori or prior probability that God, just supposing he wants to do a random religious miracle, would randomly perform a miracle for Christianity by raising Jesus from the dead, versus doing a miracle for any of the other religions. Nor is it the prior probability that God would just randomly raise Jesus from the dead among all the other religious figures that have ever existed, the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of religious figures. I mean, Hinduism alone has tens of thousands of gods or something like that. So yeah, that's not what we're asking here. That's where that would make sense from a frequentist standpoint. Well, okay, what's the prior probability that God would just randomly raise Jesus from the dead when we have 10,000 religious figures? Well, it's 1 divided by 10,000. But nobody's saying that God didn't randomly raise Jesus or arbitrarily, for no reason at all, pick Jesus out of the lot. It's not like he spun a roulette wheel and it landed on Jesus. Okay, I'm going to raise Jesus instead of Buddha or instead of Muhammad or something like that. That's ridiculous. That's what David KC and these skeptics are talking about, and makes zero sense. It is not the hypothesis under evaluation in Bayes' theorem. Instead, the real hypothesis is what is the prior probability that God, as a free will agent with all of the sufficient qualities, who is not determined by his past behavior, would freely choose to raise Jesus from the dead because he had a sufficient religious motivation for doing so. And on this front, obviously, it would be 100% because God has the sufficient mechanism. He has all of that. So it all just comes down to, okay, well, when we plug it into the Jefferey conditionalization, given the background evidence, is it a fact that God exists? Is it a fact that he has this M, he has a sufficient motivation or not? And that's where we get these things. But given this is 100%, as I said, I mean, it's impossible for him not to achieve that which he has motivation and the power to do, given who God is. So yeah, this is the main objection. It's just a misunderstanding, or the wrong reference class based on a misunderstanding of what the hypothesis is. And David KC is just, I was right, he was wrong, period. And that's why I had to state this so emphatically. I mean, and I gave the analogy. Look at me. I never took a philosophy course in my entire life, and I was not interested in it. When I took my undergrad, I took business. And I took as my electives politics courses. So I don't know how many courses I would have taken in my life before I did my master's in philosophy, but probably like, I don't know, maybe 200. Let's say. I have no idea if that's accurate or not. So out of the 200 courses, none were in philosophy. So I guess, okay, well, let's just reason stupidity. There's a 0 out of 200 chance that Dale would pick a thing, or a 1 out of 200 chance or something like that I would ever pick a philosophy course. No, I'm a free will agent. And given I have a sufficient motivation for taking a religious course, then it's 100%. I would do it. It's just a question of, well, did you in fact have this motivation or not? And obviously, do you in fact exist or not? That's not a question for me, I'm hoping. I don't think David KC is a solipsist or something. He thinks other people exist. So in this human case, it's all about, well, did I in fact have this motivation or not? And that'll speak to the prior probability. If you don't know me and I haven't given you direct evidence revealing to you that yes, I did have this sufficient motivation, then for some guy over in Timbuktu who's just saying, well, someone asks him, hey, what's the prior probability that this guy named Dale Glover, and you show him my picture, and that he would take a philosophy course, given he's never taken one, never. He went into business, and he took 200 courses, none of them were in philosophy. you would be an absolute fool to say, well, it's very low, very low. It's a 1 out of 200 chance. No, he would say, well, he's got free will. It just depends. Did he have a sufficient motivation for taking philosophy? Did something change in his life where he gained this motivation? Did he, change and become interested in philosophy or something like that, or not? I need facts. Right now, I'm 50-50. I can't judge. Maybe he took a philosophy course, or maybe he didn't, based on maybe he had this motivation to do so, and as a free will agent, then he would do it regardless of his past behavior and in not taking courses, or maybe he wouldn't. That's the same thing with God here in doing a Christian specific miracle or a religious miracle. You got to ask these two elements, these two factors. Does God exist? And two, if God exists, did he have a sufficient religious motivation for raising Jesus from the dead or not? And I kind of went over that. The last thing just to remember is, so you'll hear Christians like Dr. Mike Licona, my friend, and I think his book was the best on the resurrection. Gary Habermas, who just published volume 1 of his book, is now the best. I think he's taken the top spot just from what I've seen in the first volume so far. But anyways, Mike Licona, who I love, in his book, he says, well, the prior probability that God would raise Jesus from the dead is just inscrutable. We can't access the divine motivations of God. So it's just inscrutable to us as human beings. Great. Inscrutable probabilities translates to the default, 50%, 50-50, because that's the principle of indifference. Look, I'm indifferent. I can't tell. Was God motivated or was he not motivated to raise Jesus from the dead? Well, if you can't tell, if you have no evidence or reasons for thinking, well, he was motivated, or for thinking, no, he wasn't motivated, then you remain at the default. The principle of indifference says you remain at the 50% in the Bayes theorem for the prior probability. Inscrutable equals 50% in terms of Bayes theorem. So with that, that's my take. I've responded to everything David KC had to say, so I hope that helps. And thank you very much.